So good morning, everybody, to the Airlock IAM 7.7 webinar. We're happy to have you here and hope you enjoy the coming like 3/4 of an hour. If you have questions, you can always write them to the questions tools, and we try to answer it during the webinar. And if this is not possible, we'll do that at the end of the webinar. You can also write something to the chat in case you have something to tell to us, everybody, audio is not well or whatever. So let's get started with Airlock IAM 7.7. So before going to the details about the new features of the webinar, one more time, the last time, just a hint that 7.7 is the last version with the old and the new Loginapp, with the JSP Loginapp and the modern new Loginapp REST API. So now's the time, I think, for everybody to plan the migration if you haven't already planned it or already done it. Here again, as in the last few webinars, the time, the schedule. You see in the arrow, you see where we are now, and the next release in spring 2023 will be 8.0. It will be the first release without the JSP Loginapp. End of support for the release 7.7 with the JSP Loginapp is planned to be in mid of 2024. So you still have some time to migrate to the new Loginapp, but it's not no more really long time. So if you haven't planned the if you haven't planned the migration so far, please do so now and contact us if you need help. Just give me a second to make my mouse more visible. So I'll say something more at the end of the webinar about the migration options and what we recommend how to do it. So now let's get started with the new features in 7.7. We structured the webinar into 4 main topics. The first, which I'm going to present, is some Loginapp features. We call that chapter feature parity. It's smaller and mid-sized features that are really here to give the new Loginapp features that were possible in the old Loginapp. And it's the last bunch of features that we will implement in the new Loginapp regarding old JSP features. And after that, in 7.7, it should actually be feature complete regarding the JSP Loginapp. That's why we call it parity. So let's move on. It's a bunch of new features, and I'm going through each feature very quickly, except for the first one, where I'm going to spend a little bit more of time. The first feature is about user verification via email links. It's usually used in password reset or in self-registration, something that has been possible in the JSP Loginapp tool. It's about sending an email link to the user, and the user can click on it and then, for example, reset the password or finish the registration. Now, I would like switch to my browser to show you a little bit more about that, because in the new Loginapp, as always, things are a bit more flexible than they were in the old Loginapp. And what you see here, it looks complicated. It's actually quite simple. On the left point, we call that initiation point. There's some way how the user gets an email with a link in it. So this could, for example, the most common use case be the user entered the username because the user wants to reset the password, and then an email is sent to the user. It could also be during self-registration, or it can also be from the help desk, that somebody calling the help desk no more remembering the password, so the help desk can actually issue this email. There might also be other possibilities in the future, but we send an email to the end user with a so-called continuation token. And at the same time, we write something into the database. And then in point two, number two, the user clicks on the email and a browser opens. Now, this may be a new browser, it may be a new session, it may be the same session as before. And that's also the reason why it needs to be stored on the database. And then what happens is a new flow is started with a so-called flow continuation step. And the continuation step verifies the token in the link and identifies the user, meaning that the flow now knows who the user is, and then some flow can be configured. So actually it's starting some kind of flow, sending an email, and then continue a different flow. Now what you see here in this picture is actually just a simple POSITORY set flow, but you can do it with any public self-service flows. So we can start it somewhere, at some point send an email and continue it later in a separate flow. So that's actually the flow continuation feature used to implement POSITORY set and alike via email links, but you can do it also for other use cases. So I'm going to show you this in the config editor quickly, and it's the lowest use case on the left. So it's sending the email link from the admin app, from the user management. So I'm going to the config editor, make it a little bit bigger. So we go, so it's already configured here. I only show you where it is. We go to the admin app, to the users authentication tokens, and to the password management configuration. And here we configured the POSITORY set self-service. And what we actually configured here, you don't have to read everything. It's all about the email and what's in the email. That's not very interesting now. What is important is the target flow ID. So we send an email targeting to a flow. I called it PWD reset help desk. Just chose this name. You can use anything as a flow ID, of course. And I configured the URL to call. So if you look at the URL, it's my locally installed IAM, and then it's the URL that selects the above flow. So with some variables in it and the token in it. If I go to the admin app, click on my user, on the password tab, let's switch to English. So here I have this button, send the reset email. I'll click on it and an email will be sent. This takes a while with our email server, so we can go back to the config editor in the meantime. So now I should get a link with like this, which will start a new public self-service flow in the Loginapp and use this continuation token to identify the user. So let's look at this flow. It's in Loginapp public self-service flows. And here it is. I configured this flow with the same ID. And now it's a very simplistic flow. It actually has only the POSITORY set step in it, but and of course first the flow continuation step, which is the step that will consume the continuation token and then identify the user. And if this task has done successfully, it will go to the next step with the identified user. So let me check my email. If I got the email. And I got the email. I hope I will be able to share it with you. No, because I'm in full screen mode. Just give me a second. So now you should see the email. It isn't very nice looking, but that's not the point here. It's like this, so you really see the URL behind it. So I got this email with the continuation token. When I click on it, it will start a new session on the Loginapp. And the continuation token has been consumed successfully and verified, so I'm able to reset the password. So if you need more information about this flow continuation feature, and in particular with about the password reset and public the user registration self-services, you can find it in the documentation, also with sample flows on it. Okay, so far this is about this first feature, and then we'll go through the rest of these smaller features very quickly. So we have time for the bigger other features then. So the second line here is it's now possible to do front-side Kerberos in combination with IAM authentication flows. So you can combine front-side Kerberos authentication, for example, for Windows integrated login, in combination with anything else that you can do in flows, for example, a second factor, terms of services, whatever you like. Then we also implemented the CAPTCHAs in IAM flows. It's available for self-registration, for public self-services, and for login flows. And we implemented Re-CAPTCHA and H-CAPTCHA. Let's go to the documentation. So it's something like you see here in the upper one is the H-CAPTCHA and the Re-CAPTCHA. I'm sure you know that from, I guess it's from Google. Huh? So we implemented this and not no more the old CAPTCHAs that were really very easy to fake. So let's go back to this. Yeah. Then there is a UI, a web UI for the password end-to-end encryption feature. Again, there's a lockout self-service allowing logged-in users to lock their own accounts. We also implemented the client fingerprinting-based user account lockout. This is a feature that allows the Airlock gateway to tell Airlock IAM to lock a user if the client fingerprinting feature of the gateway says that the session is somehow bogus or too risky to continue to work on. Then we implemented the on-behalf identity propagator. It's an identity propagator that was available in the JSP Loginapp, which really gets a login page from a backend system and then logs into it and gives the authenticated session back to IAM. So it's usually used for legacy systems that can't really handle single sign-on. It's now also available in the new Loginapp. And there's a bunch of other smaller features. Please look at the changelog in the documentation if you want to see all the details. So far, these are all smaller features that give us parity of the old Loginapp and the new Loginapp. And also what Mike Dujak will tell you now about SAML is actually also part of the feature parity, but it is big enough to have a separate chapter here. So I'm glad to hand over. Oh no, one more thing. Sorry, I forgot that. In 7.6, we implemented the Remember Me feature, also in a way more flexible way than it was in the JSP Loginapp. And in 7.7, we also implemented a self-service for it. So you can now configure a REST API and also the GUI, as you see it here in the screenshot, that allows end users to see in which browsers or devices, it's not restricted to browsers, the users are permanently logged in, meaning using the Remember Me cookie and so on. So in this example, the user was logged in some time ago from this IP address, this IP geolocation. If you enable it in the configuration from Mac OS, probably it was me. Huh? And another login here, and down below is really the current session that is currently logged in. That's also the reason why there's no logout button there. So the user can manage their devices or browsers and log them out each individually. So this is a new feature that is something more than was possible in the JSP Loginapp, but we implemented it in 7.7, this release. Now let's go to SAML, and I will hand over to Mike.
Okay, I hope everybody can hear me now. Welcome also from my side. And I'm going to continue to discuss on how we're going to replace the JSP Loginapp with features that we've already had in the past. The SAML Service Provider is one of these features. Those of you that have long time experience with Airlock IAM know that we've been supporting SAML for a long time, and we've already continued to work on the SAML stack. And in Airlock IAM 7.6, we deployed the new version of the SAML implementation that supports flow architecture, that supports REST API, and that supports the REST UI for the identity provider part of SAML. SAML is fairly big protocol stack. That's why we were not able to do everything in one version. But the good news is with IAM 7.7, we now completed the work on the SAML stack. And you also find now the SAML Service Provider in the product. It will support flow architecture. It will support REST API, and of course also the UI. And to complete this little architecture sketch here, I've added what you can do with a single instance of Airlock IAM. You will have the ability to support one identity provider and an arbitrary number of service providers. That's what you can have with one single instance. Of course, if you deploy multiple instances, then you can have many more SAML identity providers and service providers as your use cases require. Feature-wise, we continue to support single sign-on and single logout, and you can do that both service provider and IDP provider initiated. I already mentioned that we are using all the advantages of the flow architecture, so you have all the bells and whistles for authenticating users, getting consent, signing off on terms of services, and all the other stuff that you have with the flow architecture. Of course, we also integrated everything into the REST UI, both the identity provider side, but also the service provider. So if you want to have user interaction on the service provider during the authentication, you can also do that. And it's fully integrated in the REST UI, so you don't need to do any custom code or custom development. And last but not least, I wanted to point out that this is all fully integrated with the existing identity providers you might already have configured. There's no need to change anything on the identity provider, regardless of whether this is an Airlock IAM running or if it's a third-party identity provider. So that seamless migration is possible with 7.7. Now, I'd like to show you a little bit on what the configuration implies. This is a config editor on a local machine here. If you're looking for the SAML configuration, you just switch over to the Loginapp, you scroll down a little bit, and you get to the section where it says SAML OAuth, OpenID Connect, and so forth. And the first entry are the SAML settings. I'm quickly entering the SAML settings, and from top to bottom, we'll find here that you can configure identity provider. Now I'm demonstrating a service provider, so the identity provider section is of course empty. And then you have here at the same place the service provider settings, where you can define multiple service providers. As you can see here, it's a list. I only have configured one, but you can configure an arbitrary number. If I enter the service provider configuration, then you can see the SP settings, and of course, right below that, the identity provider settings. Drilling down into the service provider settings, you'll find that at the core, it's still the same implementation of the SAML stack. So you still need the metadata file, the extended metadata file, and of course, you need an entity ID to identify your service provider. So there has not a lot changed with regards to what the SAML stack does, how it's implemented. The focus really was on getting it integrated with the flow architecture and making sure that you have everything in the UI and in the REST API integrated. One more thing I wanted to show you, and those that already are aware of the identity provider implementation, If you're looking at the SAML settings, I'm now back at the top of the configuration stack. There is a section common, and in here, there's the SAML federation configuration. In the SAML federation configuration, there's one thing that we've really improved already with the identity provider, but we're again using the same thing with the service provider. That's the attribute mapper. So the tedious configuration in the config files where you have to tell the system which attributes are mapped on which claims, but either for the identity provider, which attributes he needs to write into the SAML assertion, or for the service provider, which attributes to get out of the SAML assertion and put into the user context and into the session. That is now all in the GUI. So this is much less tedious. That's an improved configuration that the old JSP Loginapp wasn't able to provide with. It was much more tedious at that time. If you're asking yourself, because it's a lot of information and I went over this very quickly, how can I do that myself? Of course, we've added everything into the configuration. This is just a screenshot of the current configuration. So right beside the SAML IDP setup, you now have the service provider setup with a chapter outline that will guide you through the setup process if you're doing it for the first time, or there is also a special migration chapter that will help you migrating existing service providers to the new version. So that's it for the SAML stack and how we're going to replace the JSP Loginapp with the new features. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Risk-based authentication. Now, this chapter, Mark has prepared something, and I'll continue with a slightly different thing on risk-based as well. Mark.
So I'm back. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me, Mike? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. So risk-based authentication is something we also had in the JSP Loginapp, and which is now also possible in the new Loginapp, but again, with greater flexibility, and we also added some risk extractor features. So for those who don't know it, what is risk-based authentication about? It's about having multiple sensors, or we call them risk extractors, that look at something in the session, information from the user, look at the login history and so on, and then use this information to influence the authentication flow in some way. In the old Loginapp, in the JSP Loginapp, you could only skip the second factor or not skip the second factor or deny the authentication at all, altogether. In the new Loginapp, you can do a lot more because you can use this information in any way in the flow, and for example, take different directions in a junction, in a selection, use different subflows. You can skip steps. You can also enable steps with it, and so on. So you're really free to do whatever you want. And what we support in the new Loginapp is in terms of risk extractors. So these are the plugins that really look at something from the request from the user and so on, and then issue a risk label. These are the top three here. You probably already know they were possible in the old Loginapp too. One is looking at the IP address range of the client IP. I will make a very simple example afterwards with that. They look at the user agent header and look if it's a typical user agent header for the user. So this will also look at the user's login history. It looks at the geolocation based on the IP, and also looks if it's a normal geolocation of the user. What we added in 7.7 to the new Loginapp, which was not possible in the JSP Loginapp, is the impossible journey risk extractor, which checks if the user is at one location at one time, and then, like for example, half an hour later, it's on the other end of the globe, which is usually not possible. So of course you can configure this when it's considered to be risky and when not. And we also added two risk extractor looking at information from the gateway. So if you're using the anomaly shield, the machine learning part of Airlock Gateway, anomaly shield can tell IAM about the session state. So if a session is considered to be anomalous, IAM can use it in the risk extractor and then influence the authentication flow a user has to pass to access an application. It can also look at the client fingerprinting score of the gateway and there define on what risk score threshold to consider a session as risky or not. So how it actually works in the new Loginapp is that you have all these risk extractors in a so-called risk assessment step, which you can put that anywhere in the flow. You can also use it multiple times. And from there, the risk extractor issue a set of tags. And as you probably know, if you know the authentication flows or the flow engine in general, with tags, you can influence the whole flow. You can skip steps. You can take, you can select the selection. You can use a different subflow and so on. And from there, you can actually then do whatever you want. In the near future, there will be also other risk extractors, especially regarding Airlock 2FA, because Airlock 2FA will, in the near future, provide adaptive authentication feature that consider risk signals on the app, so on the mobile phone. As soon as that's possible with the future A service, we will also provide a risk extractor that will take this information from the mobile device and also let you use that in risk decisions in the auth flow. So let's make a very simple example. It's probably the most simple example, but it's still a useful one and a used one. So you could, for example, in the login flow, just look at the IP address of the client, so of the browser or of the mobile phone. And then in the risk extractor, define if it's within the company network, let's call it trustworthy, and skip the second factor. If access is via VPN, then consider it medium risky and ask for a second factor. And if it's something else, then do not allow access at all and show some nice message to the user. That's just a very simple example. So for the next thing, I will hand over to Mike.
Yes, thank you, Mark. So what Mark explained was kind of IAM being in the driver's seat, taking decision on what is a risk and how to deal with it. What I'm going to explain, and it's really good that we're switching roles here, because what I'm going to explain is very similar, but slightly different. And why is it different? Because what we're doing, or what I'm presenting now, is how Gateway and IAM can interact with each other, but Gateway is actually taking the decision. So what we have is, we have components in the gateway like the anomaly shield, we have client fingerprinting, but it could also be an external system that's connected over the control API to the gateway, and they can force the gateway to remove roles from a user session. So the anomaly shield somehow detects that this session is behaving anomalously, and of course, the gateway doesn't like that, so he decides to remove roles. And what we've now implemented on the IAM side is that this removal of roles can be interpreted by IAM, because what you normally do if you remove a role, you remove authorization. Therefore, the next request that comes in from the user on the gateway will return with a not authorized message and force the user to switch over to IAM to re-obtain the roles that he just lost. And that's exactly what we implemented on IAM. It can update the session by matching the roles lost and determine which tags need to be removed. And as Mark explained before, tags really are how we control flows, which steps to skip, which steps to enforce. And removing roles means that the next time authentication is required, the user will have to go through additional steps or maybe redo second factor authentication. And this is what happens here. The user must use his credential in an authentication flow to regain the missing tags. And then, of course, IAM tells the gateway through the control API to re-add those roles. So with anomalies or with things being detected on the gateway that force a role drop because the session is suspicious, we can now really decide with the flow architecture that we have on IAM on how to regain those roles, what is required by the user, and you can re-add those roles without losing the session and having to start over, which is really convenient for the user experience, and it's also very good for the security of the session. How do you do that? Well, let's face it, the explanation of the feature is a lot more complicated than actually the configuration. I've present here a screenshot where we see the plugin, the gateway remove strong role. This is the plugin that I created for removing a role mapping. And the only thing I have to configure here is basically saying if the gateway removes a role that is called strong, then I want to remove on the session for that user the tag Airlock2FA verified and the strong authentication tag. So in my example here, if this happens to a real user, the next time he tries to access anything on the back end, he will be redirected to IAM. He will have to go through the authentication flow, and with Airlock2FA verified, I already know that he will or she will have to re-authenticate in using the Airlock2FA second factor to be able to continue working on that backend system. So this is the role removal feature and the risk-based feature. They both have kind of the same goal. We can react interactively on risks on a session, and either IAM or the gateway can take the decision that roles need to be removed and users need to re-authenticate or partially re-authenticate. So moving forward, there is some other notable new features, and one of the features that we've seen very much feedback and also very positive responses from the end user community is event notifications. Event notifications, the way we've implemented it, basically allows IAM to create events, and then you can configure subscribers that will pick up on these events and inform the end user through email that something has happened on his session. These events can be account lock, password change, device being added or deleted, things like that. Now, we've improved that feature set in IAM 7.7 by adding SMS as a new standard channel in addition to email. So you can decide now if you want to send SMS messages or email messages. And the SMS feature is implemented that it sends it to all phone numbers that are configured on the user. Normally, we would expect most users to only have one phone number, but if multiples are configured, then all the phone numbers will receive the same message simultaneously. In case of an MTOM number change, this is a special case. There we will send it to all the numbers, including the old phone number. So we really make sure that if an MTOM number change, that the real user, the owner of the old phone number, is informed about that change. So the new channel is one thing. And the second thing that we did is we found that account locked is one of the features that most often used, that users are informed in the old days only by email, now either by email or SMS about the account lock. Now, account lock can have many reasons, and it was asked if we can have different messages depending on the reason. And that's exactly what we implemented. You can now filter on the lock reason, so you can implement an event subscriber that looks at the lock reason, and only if the lock reason matches, this particular subscriber will be triggered and the message will be sent. So you can have different messages on whether there were too many login attempts or password change attempts too many, or the user was locked by an administrator. You can specifically tailor your messages to the end user so that it's easily understood on the end user side what went wrong. This is for event notifications, but there's still more. We have now added self-registration. We have enhanced that, and you're now allowed to also register Airlock2FA during self-registration. This allows for a more complete self-registration, not a more secure self-registration, but a more complete self-registration of an end user. By having the Airlock2FA step added, probably at the end of the self-registration flow. The next thing we provide is that we have separate steps for user ID and password, and that makes the whole authentication process a lot more flexible, because with a separate user ID step, you can already load user data just by being provided the username, and you can decide then on the next screen on what you want to do. The user can basically for himself or herself decide on whether they want to use password authentication or an email OTP, or maybe even directly go to a FIDO or some other form of authentication. One word of warning, the user ID step itself is not enumeration protected, so it could be that depending on the situation, user enumeration is possible. Last but not least, we have added email and phone numbers in translations, also something that we've been asked quite a few times, that it's possible on the interaction with the user to use the email or the phone number. More often than not, you want to have that asked. This is now masked. Now, this is possible. You can send messages where, for example, you say, you can write a text like, we have sent something to the phone number ending in 1234, or to the email starting with AB and ending in something.com. So this is possible now. It's in the translation, so you can use it in all kinds on all cases of interaction, both in messages that you're sending to the users and also in interaction or dialogues that you're presenting on screen. This is it from my side for the highlights, but I think there is one more thing, right, Mark?
So, right, there is one more thing. Last but not least, we have a new feature in the config editor, which is called flow visualization. You can probably already guess what it is about. It's first, why did we do that? We have seen some customers doing quite complex flows in the config editor, and as you probably know, it's not really easy to see what these flows do from looking at the configuration. And so we implemented a flow visualization tool, which I will show you in a minute. Just here's a screenshot from the authentication, from a authentication flow, and you probably noticed before when Mike and I showed the config editors, you could see sometimes this new symbol there, and it's actually shown everywhere in the config editor where there's a list of steps, where there's a configured flow. So this is not only in the authentication flow, but in all situations where there's flow, like public and protected self-services, transaction approval, authentication, and self-registration, and a few other locations. So let's switch to the browser and to the configuration. I hope you can see that. So let's I showed you before. I showed you this very simple flow with the flow continuation step. So here it's not really necessary to see the flow because it looks like this, but it's still it's there. But let's use a more complex flow where you can see the value of it. Let's, for example, use another password reset flow, which is still quite simple, but it's a little more complex. So you can see user identification flow. So you can really follow the arrows, and here you have a selection, which second factor is going to be used, and so on. You can, of course, enlarge it. You can also switch the orientation. I personally prefer this one. And you can also export the image to a vector graphic or to a portable network graphic, so you can use it in documentation or do with it whatever. When you click on an element, you will get some information here. So you, for example, here you see a condition, and you see the name you gave to the condition of this selection. But let's also show you a really complex example. So this is from the demo configuration, our authentication flow that is used for the default application. It's a really complex one because we mix in all the kind of authentication related features, like all kind of second factors, all kind of migration options. And here it looks like this. So you probably can't see anything because it's too big. But now this has a complexity that really, where it should really help to have this kind of visualization tool. And here I can hopefully also click on something that is a little bit more interesting. So there's a step, the OTP OAuth authentication step, where you also see like it has a skip condition and it has tags that it will issue on access and so on. So you can click on all these elements and see important or less important information, but so you can find out what the flows really do. What it also shows here is like an activates link. This is the dynamic step activation feature. You would also see go-to links. There's none in this image, but you would see all these flow-related concepts. So when talking about this flow visualization tool, it's only read-only, but I can imagine that in future we will also add some more features like jumping to the config editor from a step, or even showing selected properties, or maybe in the far future even editing the configuration using drag and drop or whatever. We will see. So let's get back to the presentation. So this was actually the last feature. So the rest is really about the outlook to IAM 8.0 and also some hint on the migration from 7.7 to 8.0. So what will be in IAM 8.0? So it's just to give you a glimpse on what will be in the release. It's not a comprehensive list. There may be more stuff, or there will be more stuff, but this we can tell for sure. So we will support Postgres as a database at last. And we will IAM will write the user trail. Is the one, these kind of logs that are shown to the help desk with the user, so the user activity log. So it will be written to the database in addition to being written in the file. So it is easier to deploy multiple active IAM instances and see all the user trail log, which was kind of a hassle in the past. Yeah. IAM 8 will implement OAuth token exchange. It's an RFC. And what we will also do is we will remove everything that we announced in the last 6 or 7 releases, that it will be removed in IAM 8.0. So this is also a hint. Please look at the release notes in the documentation. There is a list that was ever growing since 7.1 with deprecation announcements. So please look at them. If there's something in it that you really depend on, you have to find a solution how to use something differently, or then you have to contact us. But it will be all these things that we announced years ago that they really will be removed in 8.0. Okay, so to give you a little bit an idea of what the upgrade to 8.0, because it's a major release, it will involve, just a few words on that. So 8.0 is 8.0 because it's breaking, that's why it's a major release, and it is mainly breaking because of the new Loginapp. So the major thing to do moving to 8.0 or later is migrate from the JSP Loginapp to the new Loginapp. And there's also all these deprecations that I just talked about, that they are also technically breaking because we are removing stuff, old stuff. And so this is also the reason. But that's basically, that is it. So there's no new deployment, whatever, like it was in 7.0. It's really all about the new Loginapp and some stuff we removed. We will require that all customers to update their database schema. So in the main release, it was only necessary if we use new features depending on new database schema. But now we want, in 8.0, we want all customers on the same database scheme. So this shouldn't be really an issue, and the rest I already mentioned. Then a final hint on the migration from the JSP Loginapp to the new Loginapp. Now this slide is only about the Loginapp migration, not about migration itself. So you can migrate from any supported 7. something release to 8.0 if you want that. That's on the right side. But we really recommend first migrating to 7.7 and from there on then migrate to 8.0. So it would probably be a good idea when you installed 7.7 that you start implementing the new Loginapp or migrating to the new Loginapp if you haven't done that already. Because we recommend this way because it's the last version that contains both Loginapps, so it makes it a lot easier in the config editor to really remove JSP Loginapp stuff and implement it using the new Loginapp technology. Also, you have a simpler fallback. You still have a configuration that works with the new and the old Loginapp. So in case you have to switch back to the old Loginapp for some reason, it's a lot easier. You don't have one-way migrations like you have to do with probably with the database in 8.0. So that's an easier way to go back. It's less risky. And you have more time to move to 8.0 because you can also move to 8.1 or 8.2 if you like to do that at a later time. Yeah. And last but not least, there is a feature that is only available in the 7.7 config editor, which will help you getting rid of all the plugins that are normal supported in the new Loginapp. So I'll show you a screenshot of the config editor. If the feature is enabled, it's documented in the upgrading IAM section of 7.7 how to enable the feature. If you enable it and you open a configuration still containing JSP Loginapp plugins, there's lots of plugins that are exclusively for the JSP Loginapp, which have been removed or will have been removed in 8.0. So if you open such a configuration, here I opened, for the screenshot, I opened a pure JSP configuration. I opened it in 7.7 and enabled this feature. Then you will see a new tab, which lists you all plugins that you have to remove before upgrading to IAM 8.0. If the plugins are still in the configuration, the automatic config migration will fail and will tell you, hey, please remove this and this and this and this. With this feature, you can do this in the config editor. You can just click on something and then it will select the plugin in the tree on the left and so on. So have a look if you're intending to use that feature. Have a look in the documentation under upgrading. Installing and upgrading, there's a separate page that explains how to activate this. So just a few dates and other information. The release is available since October the 5th. And as always, it's available on the Tech Zone and on Docker Hub. When upgrading from 7.6, for example, to 8.0, and you usually don't need to adjust anything unless you use new features that, for example, require the database schema to be updated. Yeah. As said many times now, it's the last minor version before 8.0. It's the last version with both Loginapps, and it's supported until, actually it's July 2024. It's not June as it's written here. Yeah. Please have a look if interested at the Academy trainings for the new release. You can go to www.airlock.com/academy, or you can also directly go to the Airlock Guru part of that, and you see where there's free training slots. Okay, this is it. Sorry for the few minutes that we were over time, and thank you very much for being here with us. And if you still have questions, we're here for the next few minutes, and we'll answer questions in the question tool. Or if you like, you can also contact us personally via email anytime. So then I say thank you and goodbye.